Hello, everyone. How are you doing this morning? Thank you. Thanks so much for having me here. It is quite an honor and privilege to be here. Whew, for some reason, I feel more nervous than the 9 a.m. one. Okay. Awesome. Well, I'm going to start this off with actually a fun question because I like to ask questions. I have a podcast. So I want you to think really quick. If you were given a show, like a talk show, that is well-watched, well-viewed, and you could have it focus on anything you want it to be, to bring awareness on something, any topics, what would those be? What would you find as important to talk about? And on the show, you bring on different guests. What kind of people would you bring on? What class of people? If it could be anybody, any caliber and stage, right? So just think about that. And then picture that you have on there your most ideal guest. And you're talking with them, having a great discussion, and it finishes, and it's such a great interview with your ideal guest. And all of a sudden, at the end, the guest takes the mic from you and puts it back on you. And they ask you, well, what's your story? Would you know how to answer that? Like, how would you answer that? Think about it. Would you know how to pull from the value of your experiences, package it all up, and kind of understand the truth behind your story? Have you really sat down with yourself and looked at your story and asked, like, what is the truth in this and who can I share this with? Anyways, you asked about that. I want to give some preface too. Leading up to the talk here, Craig had reached out and asked if I wanted to be a speaker for Paradox, and I was so beyond honored. It's such a great community, and I love how you all find value in just a diversity of stories and topics. And so I said, yes, of course. What do you want me to talk about? You know, I just figured, I was like, okay, well, there's this past year, there's been a rise of anti-Asian violence on the community. So maybe he wants to talk about that and bring awareness to that. And he's like, no, we're really just about believing that, like loving others and loving God means, exploring these stories and their cultures and whatnot. And we just want to learn about Filipina on the Rise and what you learned from that in your community. And I was like, okay, well, I came back to him. I was like, well, is it because May is Asian American Heritage Month? Like, I need an angle here. Like, what? Because I'm really good with creating something. I really wanted to make sure that the audience, it was fitting for you all. And once again, he said, well, honestly, we just want to know, like, what is the story behind this and what's the truth that you've learned? Just come with your story. And I was completely beside myself. Like, for the first time, was just kind of confronted with coming with a rawness of what my own journey was and pulling from the experiences of that. And I think I had to confront an underlying concern, which was that I wanted to make sure that you can receive me. And I was scared that if I just came with my story, it wouldn't be well received, which had an underlying fear of my story not being good enough. And so this topic today is your story is good enough. And I'd love to share how I found that in building this podcast and what I've learned. And, I have guests that come onto this platform. And it's so funny, the irony is that when they come on, I always start with we're going to start with your story because that's what matters most. And some of them are like, well, I don't know if it's, and I always affirm them, like, no, your story is good enough. Just make it as raw as possible and authentic, and we'll go from that. And so I encourage people to do that all the time, but I didn't know how to do it for myself. I'm a big believer, if you are looking to empower other people, you have to learn how to give that power back to yourself repeatedly. And so I thank you because this is a big step for me to gather with you and just confronting that for myself. And I think it could be easy to hide behind my guests and hide behind putting people in front of you when maybe you're just avoiding the risk of being misunderstood if you come up fully as yourself. But I think that's what we're asked to do, and that's the That's what we have to do to show that it's okay for others to do that as well, right? And so there's that. Thank you for letting me be here. And I'm going to share, of course, how I started this podcast and why I did it and the learnings I got from interviewing the most amazing, high impact, successful Filipino women who have broken cultural conventions and barriers and broken their own ceilings and risen to the top somehow, and the barriers that they face. I'll share what I learned from the community that has grown under this of Filipino listeners all over the world. But most importantly, as I was reflecting on preparing this, I'm going to share what the most unexpected thing that I would do was for myself, of really discovering myself and coming this journey of coming home to my own identity, of feeling pride in something I'd never felt proud for. And so I'm going to start second question. When I say the word Filipino, what comes up for you? Just think about that. What comes up immediately? Friends and family, maybe certain things you know about the culture, maybe certain characteristics. Some things I can think of is obviously, family, or that we like to offer food a lot, or, I think of our community. I think of a lot of us, there's this, a lot of Filipino nurses, and we're out there doing great things. So come on, that's the real one, which I think is so noble. And here's a funny one, is that Filipinos show up late, sorry. And, there's this inside joke of the Filipino community is whenever we see somebody in media or represented in a TV show or a movie, and we see a Filipino, we automatically know that they're Filipino, and we get so excited, and we point that out enthusiastically, like, oh, that person's Filipino. Did you know that? And I would argue there's a reason behind that, and it's because when you're very underrepresented, historically underrepresented, what have you, and you see someone, you see your face in a space, you feel a sense of belonging and connection, and we're very family-oriented people, so you almost feel that familial bond to it. And so I also want to ask a second question, what do you think of when you say Filipino, of icons, people in history, who has contributed to society? Do you know anyone who has done that, has shaped our country, our institutions, policy, any of that? Because if I'm honest, I could not answer that growing up. I can think of very little. What part of were we in American history, for example? And I, outside of maybe the U.S. military in the Philippines, growing up, I didn't see a lot of that, taught to us in our textbooks. And there's a historical kind of roots that I want to show in how underrepresentation was very tactically used against Filipinos back when we were colonized centuries ago. That if those who came in power, from Spain to Japan, and even when we were militarized, if there was an erasure of identity, then the Filipinos wouldn't be able to step into their power, and they could be more easily controlled. Filipino women could be devalued in society. So it was very strategic to have your voice taken away, your identity, your heritage kind of stripped. And I bring that up today because there's still some manifestations of that, and we have to be wary about who we're representing and what voices we're including in society. And Filipinos, as being a very diasporic community, a lot of us leave the Philippines and go around the world to other countries. We've learned to assimilate so well. We're the most English-speaking Asian country, and we assimilate so fast that sometimes we forget to hone in on our roots and really celebrate who we are and what we're doing here. And Filipino Americans, I don't know if you know this, but we're the second largest Asian American demographic in the US and the largest in California. And that's pretty significant, but yet a lot of us are underrepresented in certain spaces, and we're not really embracing, I would say, the fullness of where we come from and who we are, and sharing that enough. And so I started this podcast for many reasons, and I can talk about how it's grown. And I can talk about how we have over 25,000 listeners and followings now, and it's this great platform that I've so many opportunities around it. But I think I'd like to start about why I started this, and that it didn't start from me being empowering or inspirational, but it really started from a place of pain, of disappointment, and frustration. So little background, I was born in Manila, Philippines, and then I immigrated here when I was 7 to Loma Linda. And although I could say I'm an immigrant, I would say most of my identity is formed here as an Filipino American, and so a lot of us like to call that a 1.5 generation immigrant. And here in Loma Linda, Redlands, it's so great. We have a diverse community and get to be surrounded by, I think our community demographics is, a lot of Asian Americans, Caucasians, and a lot of Filipino Americans. And so that was great. But I kind of took for granted what it meant to feel connected to your community. Just because you're surrounded by Filipinos, what does that actually mean to be a Filipino, to be proud? Have you ever thought about that? In whatever ethnicity you are. And for me, it was like, okay, it means eating Filipino food, being around Filipino people, and that was culture to me. But if you think about it, what does it actually mean to be here, and what is our history, and how do we feel proud? Because if I'm honest, growing up here, I felt like I never fit in, and it was hard for me to feel proud growing up around so much of my own people. And it was a number of reasons. One, I saw a lot of the career paths around me. We are a majority healthcare community. And so I saw that a lot of us kind of went into the healthcare field, into nursing, into medicine, and if not that, then maybe education or ministry. Those are kind of major fields here. And those are all such noble, fields, but I didn't connect with those, and I saw that those were more of the approved paths to go to. We like to say those are medicine would be the Asian approved one. I just didn't really connect with any of those. And so I struggled to fit in with those paths, and my own community was here. I made certain assumptions. One assumption was that Filipino Americans really just want to go in these paths, and that's where we're best at, and that's what we're interested in. And then 2, we don't want to venture off into other spaces. And I would grow up looking for us in other fields, be it politics or other business, or at the C-level suites, or in let's say social impact. And I saw very little of us, so it would make me so frustrated. Are we not challenging those two? Do we not want to go there? And then I drew conclusions off of that one, I didn't fit in here. And 2, that there was no reason for me to be proud about this, because I just, I developed this tenuous relationship. And so there's an irony in me leading this podcast called Filipina on the Rise, because growing up, if I have a confession, I spent a lot of my upbringing disassociating from being Filipino. I didn't want to be too Filipino. And I hung out with my Filipino friends, but I kind of was intentional about not being too included in the group, because I just didn't want to be assumed on or a stereotype or something like that. And going into college then, I entered UC San Diego, and I think I connected with every single community there more than my own. I immediately joined a Greek sorority, and I made sure to join the most Caucasian one. I don't know, there was something wrong with me, guys. and then after that, I got into activism a lot, and so I joined Students of Color movements, and I got really into those communities, the Black Student Union, the Latino Chicana student movements, everything but my own, really. And I stayed away, I think, from that in such a weird sense. And then after I graduated, I still didn't really find that I needed to be proud of my heritage. I didn't see utility in it, I guess you would say. Moved up to the Bay Area because I wanted to be in the tech industry and be surrounded by inspirational people, kind of be motivated by what was happening over there. And I remember a day in 2019. So what I do in tech, a lot of it is working with, growing startups and growing tech companies. And a lot of my push was for bringing diversity to engineering departments. And I remember there's just this one day that, I don't know if you've ever had a work day where you've just felt kind of defeated. Well, tech is a very male-dominated field, and so a lot of this experience was me kind of fighting uphill all the time for things like diversity and more female representation. And one day I was just feeling really defeated, overlooked at work, and what I immediately went to was I needed to listen to some stories that made me feel recognized. And so I went on podcasts. I don't know if y'all listen to podcasts. I listen to a lot of them, and a lot of them I listen to are about women empowerment and Asian Americans. But I remember on the train home, I typed in the search, and the first thing I wanted to find was Filipino American stories about women, because that was going to feed me the most at the moment. And I typed that in, and there was nothing. And so I zoomed out a little more. I was like, okay, Filipino American history and women. Nothing again. And I felt this panic rising in me for some reason. And so I started looking elsewhere, and I couldn't find any stories. And then I went on Google search, and then I typed in Filipino women just to see what would come up. And what happens when you type that in is the first page of results is about why Filipino women make great brides and why you should go to the Philippines and find Filipino women wives. And I was just devastated. Like, are you joking me? It was up to that moment that I realized how important representation was, that I felt this acute pain of invisibility, of like irrelevance, of just frustration. Like, why are we not represented well enough? Like, where are our stories? Are we not telling them well? Like, where are we, And I spent my whole life suppressing that there's no need to feel proud about this or no need to associate so much with Filipino-ness. Until that moment, that's when I realized, like, I can't suppress this anymore. Obviously, this is important. Obviously, we need to be telling our stories. And so it put the onus on me, I think. A mantra that I live by is find a hole in the world in the shape of you and fill it. And so that's really what I've found that calling to do. Like, all right, you can't find the stories, so it's on you to go look for them now. And so I made it a point on myself that I would, one, look for the stories so that I could prove that we were out there, that we are doing other things, right? That we can show up and show we were successful and a force to be reckoned with, what have you, in other industries, and share that with the world. And then number two, so that other girls like me can, I knew I couldn't be the only one who is going and feeling like this, that if other Filipino girls can see stories that they could feel represented and they would feel more empowered about whatever field they want to go to. And then three, it was really some solace for myself to affirm for myself that these are out here and that I could find these and that I was wrong, to write like my assumptions that I had on my own community, which I othered for so long. And if I could share something very personal, I actually didn't share this in the first one. This podcast was really, really important for me to do in retrospection, because at the time, I was going through something really hard for a few years. And it was that I was in the middle of a very destructive and unhealthy and toxic relationship. A few years before, I had always been such an advocate. You see me, I don't know if you saw it, but I was really always like vocal and on the front of protests and speaking out with a megaphone. And because of this, I had lost my voice significantly over a course of years. I had minimized myself, made myself really small. And I basically was moved to silence. And so just doing this was a way to start building that back up. I don't know if anyone here has ever been in a situation or relationship or whatever where you felt undervalued in your voice or overlooked or just silenced. That I know that feeling. And there were moments making this podcast that after a really hard time, I would go back into my recording room, which was my walk-in closet, and I would just start recording an episode to just start reminding myself of what I sounded like again. Like, even though I lost my voice, in those really intimate moments of recording with my mic, I was just trying to recognize my own voice again. So it was really powerful for me. And so starting this podcast, I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know how to start it. I was very novice, but I remember reaching out to my first guest, and I just looked online randomly, and it was this top attorney. Her name is Janelle Lamano, and she's still a mentor to me to this day, and I actually didn't even know she was Filipino. She just looked it. So I cold emailed her. Yeah, I know, such a risk. But I'm telling you, we know. When we see it, we're like, I know you're Filipino. So going off of that, I cold emailed her and I said, hey, I'm starting a podcast. It's gonna be great, and I want you to be my first guest. Can we discuss? And she was like, yeah, of course. And so I took the train to Oakland, and I met up with her, and I shared the idea with her. And at the end, I was just like, by the way, I just want to know, do you happen to be Filipino? Because this is about Filipino women. And she's like, yes, I am. I'm like, thank God. We were just laughing about that. And so I shared with her what it was about. And then she paused and she said, you absolutely need to do this. You have to do this. And that was such permission granted for me to do something, I felt like, I don't know if it was needed. And then she asked me, what's the title of your podcast? And I hadn't thought about it since then. And I immediately said, Filipino on the Rise. It just came to me. And she's like, I love that. Yes, because it shows that no matter where you are in your life, no matter how successful you are, you should still be rising up. And so from then on, that's kind of how it started. And we recorded the first episode together. And for some reason, that episode was really, a lot of people found it, and it kind of created this next chapter, I guess you would say, in my identity journey. It opened up something I never thought it would. In that one episode after the next, every guest would share recommend another woman to another woman. And I was in the Bay Area at the time, and this opened me up to a whole network, this community of Filipino women that I only dreamed of my whole life of meeting. And they were women in a variety of fields, the founders, CEOs of authors, they were politicians, they were really just anything you can think of, multimedia journalists, they were psychiatrists and consultants and things like that, people who were just trailblazing and really on the same kind of journey where they had to go off the path and do something big, and they were making such an impact. And I was just like, so amazed and really like, I'm going to do this if it kills me, just keep on going. And so I would love to share with you some of the learnings that I had from some of these interviews and some of these women that we can learn about Filipino women, yes, but also like what it could show us just from exploring other cultures that we never thought, were out there. And second, what it actually taught me about the assumption I had made about my people and how it really re-inspired me to learn about them. So first one, Krystl Fabella, she was this showed me how Filipino women are very multifaceted. They're very entrepreneurial. That's what I collected from a lot of them, doing so many different things all at once. And we could kind of normalize this because I think it's very common to just stick to one thing, but I've noticed a lot of them were doing many things. Like, for example, she was the CEO of Sarap Shop, which is a big Filipino food brand over there, and head of design operations at Stripe, a huge tech company. At the same time, she was a business coach. At the same time, was a designer, and doing all things at once. And so I was like, okay, there's people like me out there too. Second one, who challenged my assumption that Filipinos aren't aren't challengers, aren't disruptors. So Kristen Rodolfo, she's the beauty director of Women's Health magazine, a huge magazine, and she really is in this space to continue to challenge beauty standards and norms in the makeup and beauty industry. She's always bringing in more inclusive, diverse beauty products, models, whatever, and pulling other understandings of beauty to this world, and just been leading such a movement with that. Really amazing stuff. Third, showed me that Filipino women are very, they make for great leaders because they're very family and oriented, and when that's infused, I think that could change a lot of what we see as what leaders can be, right? So Javel Lamano, actually the first guest I had, she's a top-rated attorney in the Bay Area. She runs her own all-female law firm. So cool. And she's a criminal defense attorney. So basically she stands on trial for criminals and makes sure they have the best representation. And she said she runs her firm like family. And that gave her an edge kind of to being a very prominent from there. So being a Filipino woman in a predominantly white man's playing field, taking this holistic approach has been a unique selling point for a law firm. Specifically because when people come into our office, we're not just looking into their legal problems, we're looking at all their problems. Are you hungry? Did you eat? Did you have problems putting food on the table for your children? She literally asked them these questions. How's your employment? What can we do to help you as if you were a cousin and as if we were your kuya or ate, which means big brother or sister. And that's just how she kind of operates. Sorry. Whoops. And then another guest that I brought on that has shown me like how God-fearing Filipino women are and really mentoring they could be. And it's Christine Gambito. She's actually, I don't know if you're familiar with Happy Slips. So in the beginning of YouTube days, Christine Gambito is a big pioneer in the YouTube comedy space. And she was one of the first people that I think represented our culture in these funny ways and just kind of mainstreamed, Filipino things. And back then she was huge for me and all my friends. She's well known in the comedy space too. And really, I would say an icon in that space. And I said when I started this podcast that someone I would love to bring on eventually was Christine Gambito, and she has been one of my most recent guests and is pretty much like a mentor to me now. And she shared this about, which I hold with me now, about learning to hold your passions and your dreams lightly, learning to always learn to let it go and not hold on to them strong, because you need to basically not make your identity about that. I'm going to share one of my favorite clips with her.
Your beautiful picture, So I
kind of forcing, always forcing what you think is right.
Exactly.
You can't force. You got to be flexible to say, maybe that doesn't go with that. Okay, let me put that to the side for now. Just like your passion might have to be put to the side for this season of life. So I guess overall,
fit later,
it may fit later. So it's seasons. It's life. Life is in seasons, and you never know what each season is going to bring. But as long as you keep your priorities and your eyes fixed on the right thing, and the right person, in my case is like, if my eyes are fixed on Christ and I follow him, I'm like, he's going to lead me, So otherwise you would be full of anxiety during this time. You'd be like, my dreams, my plans, I'm not in control. And there's so much unrest in the United States right now. And it would be easy to be lost in all of that and be depressed about it. But it's like, okay, Lord, but you are still in control.
Yeah. So Christine actually started off as a nurse, and she went into acting, and she was trying so hard to make acting happen. But really, her field she found was like letting go and embracing comedy. And so that was just a really cool theme that I still hold on with me, and want to share two more. Dr. Vania Manapata, she's a psychiatrist, very influential. She speaks, and she's leading certain movements within that community. But it started because early on in her occupation, Dr. Manapata, she was struggling with feeling mental illness issues, and she was facing depression and a lot of anxiety as she was treating her patients, and she didn't know if anyone else could relate, and she would go online and meet with people, but she found so much shame of even admitting that when you're in the field of psychiatry and facing massive burnout before seeing patients. And she told me that she decided to write an article and release it. And this article was titled, I'm a psychiatrist and I'm facing massive burnout and depression and anxiety before I see my patients, who she was treating them for those very reasons. And she was very vulnerable on this article about how she would start dreading seeing them because she was facing the same things, and it just became so daunting for her. And she said, there was a huge risk in releasing this because I didn't know if I would be turned down by my peers, by my profession and industry. But this was really important for me because it showed that, this Filipino, as a Filipino woman, she was a risk taker. She was able to be vulnerable and put herself out there. And through her story, when she put it out, the reception was so positive. She had many students reach out to her, so many people in their occupation reach out to her and say, thank you so much for releasing this. I felt the same way. She had people who are in the top of their, in the medical industry, who she looked up to also say thank you for releasing this. And since then has been a huge, I think, person at the forefront of this field, speaking on behalf of mental health in the medical space and making sure there's resources there. And she said this in an interview, with finding your sense of purpose, you just have this gut feeling, even though it's a risk doing it, you know that you have to. You know it's worth the risk because the outcome can be so much better, and the impact that it can have can be meaningful to a lot of people. And so another one with her, because she owned her story and she owned the truth of it, it unlocked so much for many other people. And you should see her talks and what she speaks about. It's really amazing. And then lastly, another one who's become like a mentor to me, Jessica Loza, she's an LA commissioner. She's really taught me about pointing out whose voices aren't on the table. And she's a big proponent on calling out, who's not represented here. We need to make sure we're inclusive of all communities, and that's something I've held with me as I continue. You have to build awareness about who's not at the table. There's so much we can benefit from as a government society from diverse opinions at the table. So if you're there at the table, be a voice for other people who aren't there. And then I'm gonna lastly kind of share two pillars of Filipino culture, psychology, and personhood that I learned about during this building. One is kapwa. Oh my gosh, I love this. And it's in indigenous Filipino culture, pre-colonization. This has been a pillar of our personhood. It's called the self and the other. The concept that there's a moral obligation to treat one another as equal fellow humans. Kapwa calls us to act for the common good and to make sacrifices for our community. So this was very integral and important in the Filipino communities holding together during colonization, and I still see it as very present in our modern culture and how I observe my community pulling together too. And Bayan, Bayan comes from the root word like nation, and it's a spirit of cooperation, uniting as a community to achieve a common goal. And there's the root of this is literally in indigenous Filipino culture, families would come together if someone would have to move their home to another place, and they would all pick up their home together and move it together, literally. And so there's these concepts in Filipino culture that I think it'd be so great to celebrate and really personify back in society and the way that we lead or we run things, that I've found I've started taking pride, I think, in these things that I never knew about before. And then lastly, that I learned that I was never alone in my journey. A lot of my own journey, I saw there was parallels in the meta narrative, in the meta experience of a lot of other Filipino women. Jelaine, she was another guest. She's a founder of a huge fashion brand that elevates Filipino artisans and brands all over the world. But she had the same experience as me. She said she pushed down a lot of her identity actually as a Filipino Canadian, of not having to relate and not feel proud about it. And she said, you know, there comes to a point, there's so much of your life that's spent trying to run away from that Filipino side of yourself. Then all of a sudden I find myself running a company that's centered on Filipino heritage. And she asked herself, like, how can I ever be the one to do this? I can never be the perfect Filipino. But then I started asking myself, what is the perfect Filipino? And why do we have that? And so there's, this shared wrestling that we have. Oh, hi. You want to come and talk? Yeah. But the beauty of this shared experience that we were never going through this alone. I want to end with kind of the feedback from the community of listeners. And that has been the most enriching part of when listeners reach out and say why this has meant a lot to them. This one girl wrote, I used to disown my culture because I grew up first in spaces where white people were the majority and then Latinx and Black. So it felt like I was just weird for not fitting in anywhere. Please keep sharing your stories because they have impact and they've helped me to create a sense of belonging in a country where I so often felt overlooked, ignored, or dismissed. And so my last takeaways for everybody, I want you to walk away and think of, is that what I've learned as I've built all this for myself, for you, is that representation really matters. It matters so much. It's the difference between someone feeling they belong in something or not. You know, someone had reached out to me and said, thank you for the episode about Jessica, the politician. Because of that, I decided to go for this position, and now I'm going to run for this position in council. Just little things like that. Representation matters in, there's this richness of our lives that we have just from learning about other people's cultures, of not assuming things. I made assumptions of my own community for so long, I othered them, and it's brought such a richness in my own life. And second is when you own your truth, you unlock it for others. What part of your own story can you start understanding your truth from and then speaking on that? Because once you do that, the results are really manifold. You start unlocking that truth for other people who just needed permission to hear it, just needed to hear it from another person and claim it for themselves. And then third, something, like opportunity y'all are giving me is you can only hold the mic for others for so long until it's time for you to get behind it. Where are you pouring into other people's lives where you can start giving yourselves permission to show up, right? To start owning who you are. And once again, this talk is about like your story is good enough. Maybe thinking about where can we start showing other people that their story is good enough. That maybe we don't know about it yet, but we can start saying, you don't need to draw these big conclusions or aspirational themes out of your life before you could just show up with the fullness and the rawness of your story, right? Where can you sit down with your own self and start valuing your experience and your journey for once, really, and seeing that it's good enough. It's going to be good enough for somewhere in some place for someone else. And if you're wondering, like, I don't know my story really yet, or if you do, you think you have an experience, but you don't know what it's good for yet, or who's going to listen, or maybe you don't know if your story is worth telling. Coming from someone who has grown up her whole life questioning if I had a story that mattered, if we had a story that mattered, if there was value in even sharing it with people, coming from someone who really struggled to find that, because I thought it was too messy, or I was misunderstood, but I found that the gold and was in that, right? This platform was built off of that. coming from someone who wants others to keep sharing their stories, because that's what it's going to unlock so much. I want to say your story is good enough. I want you to give yourself permission to fully embrace that you don't need to make it something more than it isn't, but it's going to unlock so much for other people. So if you can just embrace the fullness of your story, I want you to know your story is good enough. Thank you.